Well, welcome back to the Anti-War Room. I'm Tom Andrews from Win Without War. Darcy Scott Martin is here. I knew I was going to do that at some point, but Darcy Scott Martin is here on my right, and on my left, John Issacs. Darcy from True Majority, John Issacs from Council for a Livable World, and we're here to talk about what the heck is going on in the House and Senate. We have, as we talked about last week, sure enough, the House and the Senate are facing yet another vote on the supplemental to fund Iraq. And what is happening now in the House, there's a compromise that leadership supposedly is putting together that calls for $95.5 billion in spending for the Iraq war, $30 billion of which would be made available immediately, and the balance of which would follow a vote that would take place sometime in the summer. In addition to that, there's been floating around the idea that a vote on a real substantive bill that would actually end the war and provide money only to begin the systematic redeployment of troops, that vote would be allowed in the summer as part of that package. Is that right? Over in the Senate, it's pure chaos. We have no idea what's going on, except we're hearing from the Senate that if the House passed what I've just described, it's dead on arrival by the time it hits the Senate, so we're back to square one. What is going on?
Well, first, just the Senate is not quite so chaotic as you say. They haven't come to decision, but it's pretty clear they're moving towards so-called benchmarks. In other words, requirements that the Iraqi government do some things, forgetting the U.S. government. The Iraqi governments achieve greater unity and better trained forces and deal with oil and come up with some unity government before further money could be used. It's not clear if there'll be any deadline for the Iraqis. In other words, it could be just benchmarks for the Iraqis, or it could be benchmarks and consequences if they don't meet. That seems to be where the Senate's going, but that really is not decided, and they're going to wait till after the House decides.
So since we can't hold the Bush administration accountable, we might as well hold the Maliki government accountable.
Exactly.
That's it.
Exactly.
So what do you think about this? The compromise that is being fashioned in the House, Darcy. If I sat down with you as a member of Congress and asked you what to do, what would you advise me?
Well, I think that obviously the compromise was written because people were so afraid of being accused of not funding the troops that are on the ground right now. And by being able to create an opportunity for some pool of money to move, they can push that argument further down the road and face it at a later date. Then the July vote, which will be, obviously pretty unpopular in the Senate, and if the Senate doesn't pass that kind of bill, what will come out of conference committee will not include that July date. So it clearly is a panacea for a certain number of House members, and it's a very simplified, streamlined way of having an ability to move forward. I don't know what that's going to mean when the bill comes back after conference to House members, and whether they're willing to go back and support it without the July vote. I assume that once it is passed in the House, there will be a certain demand by members who wanted that vote to get out to have it regardless of whether it's attached to secondary funding or attached to something else, because they'll say, you promised us that vote. We want that vote. So I assume that they will push to have that in the summer regardless of what it's attached to.
So what the Senate is trying to do to get the 51 votes, John, and we've heard from Ben Nelson saying that I will not vote for any kind of a timeline in the sense of fencing off some of the money for a later vote. So if that's the case and you need 51 votes, does that mean that the Senate is going to just give the money, give the president what he wants, fund without any, except for perhaps benchmarks for Maliki, just give the president the money he wants for the war?
I think that's the most likely outcome. I just want to say one advantage of the House approach is the following. One of the strategies for Democrats, at least, is to put the pressure on Republicans, almost all of whom are supporting the war and supporting the president. They say they're not so sure about the war, they're not sure how well it's going, but they still support the president. So Democrats are trying to force Republicans to vote in support of or against the war. The House approach guarantees a vote this week on Iraq, a vote in July on Iraq, a vote in the fall on Iraq, and keeping the pressure on Republicans either to support the war, which will have electoral consequences, or oppose the war. And that's one advantage of the House approach. Senate is most likely just to approve the money with these so-called benchmarks.
But if you're a progressive member of Congress, or even if you're a non-progressive member of Congress and have constituents at home saying, "Damn it, vote to get these kids out of harm's way. Stop enabling this administration. Stand up and put something on his desk that perhaps is even more restrictive than the one before, or at least as tough. Why do we have to be intimidated by those who are on the right on this war? It's a very unpopular war. Why don't we just stick to our guns? And if you're that member of Congress, why would you continue to vote in this way?
Well, and if you watched over the weekend television and saw John Edwards' advertisement, his advertisement says, give the president the same bill over and over. Now, it's easy for John Edwards to say that because he's not in the Senate anymore, and some of the Senate candidates who are running for president, Senate members who are running for president, have found that to be a trickier thing to ask for. But they're getting external pressure from other people who are allowed to have the same political megaphone, but don't have the same consequences and structure and rules they have to follow. So it is definitely getting more and more difficult. And I think that the House progressive members have the best leverage they've ever had right now to get things that they want in the bill.
But Tom, part of the problem with democracy is you need a majority. So we could get the vote on ending the war immediately, and I'd vote for it, and the three of us would vote for it. And a lot of progressives would vote for it, but we'd still be short of the 218 votes, so we can have this pure vote, stop the war immediately or stop it within 6 months, but we still have to get a majority in the Senate and the House to approve that. So there's a difference between expressing a pure position that we'd like to see and then convincing a sufficient number of other members of Congress to say nothing of Americans that they want to get out of the war instead of timetable to get out.
Easy for you to say. Yeah, I know. I mean, it's true. But the other side of democracy is that the majority of the people in many of these districts are saying, we want you to vote to get out of the war, and we're tired of you compromising.
Even in swing districts, even in very close districts, that's now the majority opinion. And I also am very intrigued by this kind of new little news burst that went on with senators, Republican senators, saying, well, September's really, we're going to just have to see. So I'll be very interested, obviously I would love to see the war end before September, but I have my doubts. And so what will they be able to claim now that they've all laid down this benchmark, made this line in the sand about September better be so much better or else? Will we then be getting the Sununu vote? Will we then be getting the Norm Coleman vote? Will we then be getting, the Susan Collins vote?
Increasingly so, since Susan Collins is now facing the opposition of Congressman Tom Allen, who announced this week that he is going to be running against Susan Collins. So you've got the consequence of failure, of course. On the one hand, the threat of no funds, the funds are cut off because the Congress can't deliver. That is to say, if you don't get the 218 votes and the 51 votes in the Senate. The other one is gridlock. A Democratic Congress would be accused of gridlock and being unable to function. And, of course, that's a threat. So it's a tight situation for members of Congress, and certainly for all of us who want to see this war end. It's a very tough situation. We also have the Defense Authorization Bill is on its way. And, John, what are we likely to see from that? Chairman Skelton, of course, the way it works is that the chair of the committee, after the subcommittees mark up their portions of the bill, the chairman of the committee does what they call a chairman's mark. They basically write what they'd like to see in the bill, and then if you want that out, you as a committee member can then put an amendment on the floor of the committee to make some changes. What are we likely to see from this chairman's mark, John?
The House Armed Services Committee should complete the Defense Authorization Bill today or certainly this week, and we don't expect very much on Iraq from that committee. Chairman Skelton, who may agree with us, is trying to maintain a bipartisan majority for his bill. But we hope when the bill goes to the floor next week that the rules permit votes on amendments to get out of Iraq, a Barbara Lee or Jim McGovern or that kind of amendment to get us out. And forgetting July, there's no reason not to have votes on getting out of Iraq as part of the Defense Authorization Bill next week.
And do you think those kind of amendments would be allowed on the floor?
I think the inclination of the House leadership is not to allow that, so we have to push between now and Tuesday to get that done. So
for those of you who are trying to keep score, we've got the supplemental, that's the emergency funding bill to get us to the end. Then there's the authorization for the Defense Department, which gives the Defense Department its authorization to spend money in the fiscal year 2008, starting on October 1st. And to get from the Authorization Committee, the Armed Services Committee of the House, to the floor, you have to go through the Rules Committee, and the rules set the terms for the debate on the floor. So that's what is all transpiring now. What should people be telling their members of Congress, Darcy, during this tense week here in Washington?
That's kind of a tough question, actually. There's I don't think a clear consensus amongst folks who've been advocating on the war over the last number of years. There's a certain contingent that says, no supplemental is a good supplemental, and so therefore no on all of them. There are some who would say, the July vote gives us another bite at the apple, so we'll support that, but we won't support the Senate version. And certainly there are many people in the Democratic Party who say, we've got to be done discussing this and move on to other things. Because, in fact, it is the case that Democrats, since winning in January and having such high approval ratings, have dropped significantly and are back to a more generic base, mid-level approval level, because people are frustrated by how this just seems to be going nowhere. The 100 Days glory is gone, and now it's like nothing's happening. So
therefore, even more reason for the Democratic leadership to try to fashion some kind of a compromise so there's not more gridlock, and then they can get on to other bills. Wow. Well, we'll see what happens. It is Wednesday. We're going to have a lot of action on the floors of the House and Senate today, tomorrow, and possibly on Friday. We're going to give you a recap of exactly what happens and then talk about what's coming up next week when we sit down together at the Anti-War Room next week. Darcy Scott Martin, John Issacs, thanks very much for joining us, and thank you. We'll see you next week.